Hi, I'm Seawolf, and I'm the creator of Mission Control, a BattleTech mod that allows you to change spawn zones and add additional lancers to the game. A lot more will be coming to the mod soon, but that's the current version for 0.1. And I've been asked to make a short video on showing how you can make custom lancers that will be the configuration that show up when the additional lancers spawn. So let's get to that now. So currently with the game, I created just a basic lance. So I've opened up the mod folder, and this is what you would have in your mod tech folder, the Mission Control mod. And you can see the usual types of things, the mod JSON, and this is the custom settings JSON for Mission Control. So as you can see here, I created some a generic test lance and some other lances that just don't exist. So if anyone's been turning the debug mode on, they might see messages saying, for instance, the heavy missile lance was selected, but it doesn't exist, so we're defaulting to the generic battle lance. Now, the additional lance feature of Mission Control allows you to specify lance configurations for any type of contract type, but you can also select specific lance configurations for specific contract types, like destroy base or defend base, like here. Or you can also select them based off the biome. And what you can additionally do is select lance configuration specifically for the enemy and also specifically for the allies that spawn. So the only one that's really used at the moment is the generic battle lance, and you define your Mission Control lances in the lances folder. There should be 3 ways to define your lances. There's only 2 of them work at the moment, so I'll go through both of those, and I will also go through the third option you can do that will be fixed in 0.2 release. Okay, so before we go any further, I would highly recommend that anyone who really wants to play around with the lancers should read the documentation that I've written. This is on GitHub, so you can see it's github.com/seawolf/mission control. And if you scroll down, you'll find the feature set, and you will find a section for additional lancers. And it's the full configuration option, is that blue link there. You will see I've written quite a lot. I go into details in the full configuration, the JSON configuration for the settings.json. This is where we were just now. And I explain each bit, what you can do with it, and what the default options are for it. And then I also then go down into where we'll be going in a second. It's the lance definition breakdown. So you can see here, for instance, it's a kind of a page full of JSON. Now, if we open the generic battle lance that's in the lances folder, which is what's being referenced in the settings JSON here, you'll see it's actually quite a bit smaller, because most of the options in the JSON that I outline here, they're optional. So they just give you the flexibility to use them, but if you don't use them, just remove them from the configuration, because it makes it clearer for people to see. Okay, so I'll go through this step by step. So we have a lance key. Each lance configuration in Mission Control will need this. This is how the settings JSON can reference it. So you can see it's all capital case. It doesn't need to be capital letters, but just for version 0.1 I've done that. So the generic battle lance will reference this generic battle lance file. So the file name doesn't actually make a difference. You could call that something completely different, but obviously it makes sense to call it something that you can link to what you're building here. So you see then there's a lance ID called tagged. Now, I've adopted the majority of the conventions that BattleTech game actually uses for its own lances. So the good thing is, if you're used to making lances in the core game as a mod, maybe you've made your own Rogue Tech lances, or you made your own just vanilla lances, then you should maybe understand some of this convention here, because it's as close as possible. So what tagged actually means is just you're telling the game that you want them to find a lance based off the tags provided. It's as simple as that, really. So, for instance, if you wanted other options, you need to find the lance def ID, and if you check the GitHub manual, you can see here now already that I have an example here which is tagged, and I go into a bit more detail. You can actually set this to manual instead, and what manual allows you to do is it allows you to manually and specifically create your lance configuration in this file, because as you notice there are no mech names or no vehicle names at the moment. It's all based on tags, so it's just another way of building your lance configuration. So with a generic battle lance, I say I want it to be a tagged lance. I want the game to find me a lance. I want a lance any lance that has the tag lance _ type _ battle. So when you're developing this and you want to know what is a battle lance type, what kind of mechs exist here. So these mechs exist in the streaming assets folder of vanilla. Now if you were looking for a Rogue Tech lance, then of course you'll be looking in the Rogue Tech mod folder. But just for an example here, we're going to be opening up the streaming assets folder, and we're going to go just do a search for that tag, because we're interested to see what kind of mechs are available here. When we search for a tag, you'll see it appear probably in a few places. So we've got some that will show up currently in a contract, because contracts have lance overrides. So we're not really interested in that in particular right now, because we're not defining our lances in contracts. These are the additional lances that Mission Control will spawn in. So just worth making sure you're not selecting a contract, because you might get yourself confused. So if we scroll down, and here we go, we've got some data lance, if you can see my mouse. So this is now we found some mechs that have the lance type battle tag. So Mission Control then will say to BattleTech, I only want these lances to spawn. BattleTech will go away and select from any of these lances that have this tag on it. So alternatively, if we said that maybe we didn't want the battle lances, or you wanted to make a new configuration that maybe, let's just say, was only a light lance. So what we'll do is we go back to our Mission Control lance configuration, and let's just copy the default one. So however you'd like to copy it, I'm using VS Code. I'm just going to duplicate it, but you could copy it any way you want. And we're going to call this a generic light lance. Okay, so it looks exactly the same as the generic battle lance at the moment. But what we're going to do here now is we're going to change this lance type battle to lance type light now. I can keep everything else the same for now. What we would definitely need to change, though, we need to change the lance key, because this is unique. So I'm going to call this a generic light lance. Save this. Now I go back to my settings file and I say, well, I want the entire game, all allies, all contract types, all biomes to use this new lance. So I'm just going to add it at the end of here. So what this does is adds it to what I've called the lance pool. It's just the available lances that the game and Mission Control can select from. For a perfect example is then in a map that has a successful enemy to be spawned, for instance, it will say, well, what mechs are available to me, or what lances are available to me. And if it's on all, then these two will automatically be placed into the pool, and anything else below, if it satisfies the right criteria, that will be thrown into as well. And then one will be selected at random. So just because you've added this light lance here doesn't mean you won't quite often get the battle lance. but it does allow it to be selectable. Okay, so if we go back to the light lance, you might have noticed there are some options here. These are the unit spawns. This allows you to be a bit more specific on what will appear in your tagged lance. So we said, well, we want the type lance, light lance, but we said, well, we want to be a bit more specific than that. So we've defined here the 4 units because vanilla BattleTech and 0.1 of Mission Control can only support 4 units in a lance. That will change in a future patch with Mission Control, but this is how it is right now. And we said ideally we want the lance to exist with 3 mechs and a vehicle. And what also we would like, there are only a few special tags for what's called a spawn effect. Now, you might, if you played the vanilla game, you might have noticed that certain mechs could be already damaged. Now, this is this special tag here called a spawn effect tag, and it's spawn poorly maintained 50. Now, that means it's got 50% armor. There are a few versions of this. There's 25 and 75. So that's just how much armor they have on them. Okay, so to go into more detail, you're able to create specific lances like you're able to do in the contract overrides. For an example, I'm going to copy the generic battle lance, and I'm going to name this specific battle lance. And I'm going to change the lance key to specific battle lance. We're going to need to change this from tagged because we've decided we're no longer going to be using the tags. And you change the lance definition ID to manual. We don't need any tags because we're not using the tagging system, so we'll just leave this empty. And then we can start populating our specific lance here. For our lance, as an example, we're going to select 2 mechs and 2 vehicles. We're going to make this kind of a support lance. So I have some saved mech definition IDs we need here. So the unit type will definitely still be mech. We will create a unit def ID, which you can read about in the documentation, and rather than this being tagged, we add the mech definition ID into this. We're creating a king crab that will be poorly maintained 25. And it's sometimes just easy just to copy and paste a block that you've already done. And we're going to make our second mech. This is a Jaeger mech definition ID. You find the mech definition IDs in the streaming folder, streaming assets of the vanilla, or in any mod structure that has been created that you're deciding to use. So as you can see here, we have a lot of mech definition IDs, and you would use the description ID. So you can see here there's a mech def battle master. So we're using the king crab and the Jaeger mech. So you can, for the vehicles, you could specify the same thing. You could specify a vehicle definition, or you could also leave it to the BattleTech system to auto-populate a vehicle for you. So for this, we're going to be leaving the 2 vehicles as tagged, just to prove that you can mix and match. So we have 2 vehicles here. They're both carriers, so we might get a SRM carrier or an LRM carrier. And then we have 2 specific mechs that will always be with those 2 randomly generated vehicles. So that's all you would need to do to use a specific battle lance. You would select this ID and you would add it into your lance pool, like this for instance, and that would enable it for both enemies and allies to use this specific lance. So if you went into battle, you would then see if this lance configuration was used, you would always see a king crab, a Jaeger mech, and 2 carriers. Okay, so yeah, just follow the documentation and take it from there, really. So that's the first method of creating a lance. Now, the second option is more of a kind of reference. So you're creating your lances here. You might realize, okay, well, you don't really want to do this every time, especially redefining the units again, especially if you just want to point towards a rogue tech lance. Why would you want to fill everything here? It's a waste of my time. So you can use this reference example. Now the reference example has a unique key, like the last versions we were seeing, but instead of the lance ID being tagged, as we saw here, and instead of it being manual, like in the documentation, you actually specify the exact lance definition ID. Now, if we go back to our lance definitions, you'll see up here, it's under description and ID. For example, this is lance def, mech, D4, dynamic, light, medium, battle. We go back here, and yeah, it just happens to be the same one. So you would use that ID, you would select it in here, and you were still able to specify any spawn tags. So if you wanted the entire lance to be damaged by, you only have 50% of the armor, then you could still put that tag we had in there earlier. So you would then say, let's place this tag in here. And yeah, so this, if it looked like this, it would mean all the lance units would be only 50% armored. So then there is this lance difficulty adjustment, and if I'm honest with you, I'm not exactly sure what that does. In the code, it looks useful. It looks like it's used. I think other people who've been developing on contracts specifically might know what this does. So I figured I would include it, and we can figure out how it works in the next month or two. So yeah, that's brutal honesty for you. So that's the second way to do it. So you would basically add this reference lance example into your settings. So you could say, for example, allies. We already have it in here. All allies would have the option of having this reference example lance. And this is in addition to the global 2 lances that we specified earlier too. So the third way to specify a lance, which doesn't work at the moment, I thought I had fixed it for 0.1, but obviously not, is this method here. Now this is the lance definition ID that we saw, or the same format we saw for the reference example here, but I'm allowing it to be supported, just putting it directly into the settings.json. Now you'll notice then you don't have the option, you won't have the option of specifying the lance difficulty or the spawn effect tags. They will just default to, well, 0 and no tags. And it's for people who really don't care about the spawn tags or the lance difficulty. They just really want to add it in there, and they don't want to even do the small JSON lances. They just really want to throw in as many lances from other mods as possible, and well, yeah, I want to support that too. So it doesn't work for 0.1, but I'm going to fix the bug for 0.2 next release. And then just that pretty much sums up how you can create your own lances and configurations for 0.1 Mission Control. There are lots of options here that you can exclude contract types. So you could say, I don't really want additional lances spawning on the destroy base ones because I feel that the enemies get enough units there. So you could say, for instance, I want to exclude destroy base, and no additional units will be spawned for allies or enemy because it's in this top section. But going back to the example I was saying, if you didn't want it just for enemies, then you would add it in the enemy section here. You could say I just don't want destroy base, so there we go. So that means enemies will never spawn on destroy base, or the additional enemies. Max, at the moment, there is a minimum of always 1 lance. So we'll always do a roll of 1. I'm probably going to change that for 0.2 because I think it's a bit misleading. I'm going to make the minimum 0, so if you turn max to 0 right now, what would happen is it's a bit misleading. It will always roll for 1 lance. So the way to get around it, if you don't want any lances spawning, you actually have to change the chance, which I had for 1 for test purposes. You have to change that down to 0 because normally it's 0.4 and 0.4 for both allies and enemies. Yeah, so that's about it right now for 0.1 of mission control and lance configuration. So I hope this helps. Thanks a lot, and I hope you enjoy the mod.